Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the coldest myths of all literally. You picture a medieval winter and instantly think of roaring fireplaces, long feasts, nobles wrapped in velvet robes, maybe even the occasional bard plucking a lute by the hearth. Sounds cozy, right? Well, I hate to break it to you, but you probably wouldn't last one night in those stone walls. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to subscribe, because if you don't, tomorrow's story will simply vanish from your feed. And trust me, you don't want to miss it. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the castle gate, expecting warmth to greet you like a friendly hug. Instead, the first thing that hits, those walls weren't insulation, they were massive refrigerators. Heat from a fire escaped upward through high rafters, leaving everyone at ground level shivering. Picture yourself standing there, your breath puffing out like ghostly fog, realizing the grand hall feels more like a cave. And huts, oh huts, were worse. Thatched roofs leaked, walls made of wattle and daub barely blocked the wind, and snow sometimes sifted straight through cracks. Some peasants joked that their cottages had more windows than walls, except the windows were just holes where the wind slipped in. One villager's point of view: you curl up under a pile of straw with your children pressed against you, listening to the fire sputter. The smoke curls down instead of up, stinging your eyes, and you whisper a prayer the embers last until dawn. Historians still argue whether castles were warmer than huts, or actually worse, since stone absorbs cold and radiates it inward. The general consensus: if you were indoors, you weren't safe from the chill, you were trapped inside it. And let's talk about those fires. A single hearth couldn't heat. People huddled close, while the rest of the room stayed as frosty as a barn. It's like gathering around a candle in a warehouse. That glowing fireplace in your imagination. More psychological comfort than physical relief. There's a quirky record from a 14th century monk who admitted he envied peasants because, at least, their huts were small enough for one fire to warm. His monastery's stone dormitory, meanwhile, was so cold that ink literally froze in the ink. Imagine trying to write scripture while shaking so hard your quill squeaks. By the way, medieval people really did joke about the cold. In some English taverns, they said the ale's warmer than the bed. And honestly, they weren't wrong. You might think nobles fared better. After all, they had tapestries, thick drapes, and feather beds. But even the richest lord woke with frost on his blankets. Visitors to castles often remarked that their water jugs iced over at night inside. The grand stone fortress became a freezer by morning. Even livestock were pressed into service as heaters. Families in huts sometimes brought goats, chickens, or even cows indoors. Yes, you went to sleep with your children on one side and a snoring cow on the other. Not exactly the cozy fireside image you had in mind. And the myth of warmth equals health. In reality, smoke inhalation was a killer. Homes had little ventilation, so instead of cozy warmth, you got lungs full of soot. Children developed chronic coughs, and adults lived with what today we'd call indoor pollution. Scholars debate how much this contributed to medieval respiratory illnesses. But it's safe to say the fire that was supposed to save you might slowly suffocate you instead. One small comic aside: you know how in winter today we fight over the blanket on the couch. Medieval families fought over who got the warm side near the fire. Except in their case, the losing side wasn't chilly, it was downright icy. And if you're wondering, well, what about castles in southern Europe? Surely warmer there? Not really. Thick stone walls were designed for defense, not comfort. In winter, whether you were in France, Germany, or even sunny Spain, your castle doubled as a giant stone icebox. So next time you imagine knights in fur cloaks warming by a fire, remember, you'd be sitting there too, teeth chattering, smoke in your eyes, and the warmth fading the second you stepped away. The romance of cozy medieval fires. Nothing but myth. But the next myth is even stranger. You picture yourself pulling a heavy fur cloak around your shoulders. The kind Hollywood knights, whereas they stomp through the snow. Surely that saves you, right? A medieval winter wrapped in animal pelts sounds like nature's central heating. The truth, those cloaks were damp, heavy, and often worked against you more than for you. Think of it, fur wasn't a neat little jacket from a modern store. It was entire animal skins stitched together, heavy enough to drag your shoulders down. If the weather was dry, maybe you'd be lucky. But snow and sleet soaked straight in, turning those cloaks into icy blankets that clung to your body. Instead of warmth, you carried a freezer strapped to your back. There's a record from the household accounts of Edward III where laundresses complained about washing noble cloaks, took days for the pelts to dry, and by then the smell was so foul servants sometimes refused to handle them. Imagine trudging through a hall while the person next to you reeks of wet fox fur. And peasants, they didn't have wolf pelts or ermine. Most made do with sheepskin, which trapped warmth but also sweat. By nightfall, the inside was damp, and by morning it stiffened into frozen armor. You had to beat your cloak against the wall just to soften it enough to wear again. From a villager's eyes, you rise at dawn, your breath white in the air, fumbling with the cloak that crackles as you bend it. It feels more like wearing bark than fabric, but it's all you've got before trudging into the frozen fields. Historians debate whether fur cloaks really kept out disease or invited it in. Medieval medical texts claimed warmth preserved humors, while others insisted that damp fur made fevers worse. Today we know one thing: a wet, frozen cloak hugging your chest was a straight path to pneumonia. And here's a quirky tidbit: fur wasn't just for warmth. It was a fashion weapon. Nobles flaunted ermine lynx, or even leopard if they could import it. People didn't just see furs as insulation, they were a walking billboard of status. But when temperatures dropped below freezing, no one cared how regal you looked if you were still shivering to the bone. There's a small bit of humor here. Picture a knight wrapped in fox pelts, stomping dramatically into the hall, only to slip because the wet fur turned into an icy rug under his boots. Yes, it happened, chroniclers wrote, of nobles toppling in their own cloaks. And it wasn't just the cold you had to worry about: the creepy crawlies living in those pelts. Lice and fleas thrived in fur. Once the cloak warmed up around your body, the insects woke up too, turning warmth into an itchy nightmare. You'd scratch all night, only to freeze when you kicked the cloak off in desperation. One monk in the 12th century even mocked nobles for their obsession with fur, writing that they boast of warmth while shivering in silence. It's one of those timeless truths. Looking rich didn't make you any less cold. And here's a callback to your image of roaring fires. You sit close to the flames, hoping your cloak dries out. Instead, the damp fur steams, filling the room with a wet dog smell. Everyone wrinkles their noses, but no one dares move away from the fire, because, stink or not, it's the only hope of thawing out. So, that fantasy of wrapping yourself in fur like a medieval lord and laughing at the cold, forget it. Those cloaks were status symbols, wet rags, and flea hotels rolled into one. And in the end, you'd still be coughing in the night, wondering if the next morning would even come. But trust me, the next myth makes even fur cloaks look like a luxury. You probably picture medieval winters as endless banquet boars turning on spits, pies bursting with meat, and goblets of wine passed around a roaring fire. Hollywood sells us that image of merry feasts lasting all season. But here's the truth. Winter wasn't about plenty. It was about scraping, stretching, and slowly running out of everything. The rhythm of food was seasonal. After the harvest in autumn, people celebrated with festivals, but by midwinter, the stores were already thinning. Grains grew moldy, barrels of salted fish went slimy, and meat kept in underground pits spoiled faster than anyone wanted to admit. Even nobles, who began winter with pantries full of venison and pork, quickly found themselves staring into near-empty larder. For most peasants, the main dish wasn't meat, but pottage, thin stew of whatever was left. Picture yourself staring into a pot of cloudy water with a few floating roots, maybe a wilted cabbage leaf, and one small scrap of bacon if you were lucky. Day after day, you ladled the same flavorless sludge into a wooden bowl, knowing spring was still months away. From the eyes of a servant in a castle kitchen, you lean over a smoking cauldron, hoping the broth thickens, but there's nothing to add. You toss in stale bread to give it weight, and pray the Lord doesn't notice his table is shrinking from feast to famine. Historians still debate how much protein peasants really got in winter. Some argue they had enough dried beans and peas to survive. Others say famine was so frequent that entire villages went weeks without solid food. What's certain is that when the salt ran out, meat rotted fast. Winter tables didn't smell of roasted boar. They smelled of sour beer, rancid butter, and desperation. Here's a quirky tidbit. In desperate years, people boiled tree bark into a flour substitute, making bread so bitter it caused stomach cramps. Chroniclers in Scandinavia even described bark bread as a meal of hunger, not of life. Imagine sitting down to dinner and gnawing a slice of wood. And yet, nobles tried to keep appearances. At court, they'd stretch feasts with pageantry elaborate sugar sculptures, colored jellies, and pastries that looked impressive but offered little real sustenance. Guests clapped and admired, but left hungry. Think of it as the medieval version of Instagram food, beautiful on display, disappointing in your stomach. One small joke fits here. People said the only thing that multiplied in winter was watered-down ale. That's right, brewers stretched barrels by adding more water, until the beer was more like murky snowmelt with a frothy cap. And famine didn't just strike the poor. Even kings starved in siege winters. One famous example, during a siege in the 14th century, the defenders of a castle boiled horse hides for soup. They scraped off the hair, tossed the leather into pots, and chewed the rubbery strips for survival. Hunger didn't respect titles. By late winter, fasting became less a religious choice and more a grim reality. Lent overlapped with hunger season, forcing families to survive on even less when supplies were already gone. The irony. The holiest season was also the hungriest. And let's not forget the psychological grind. You wake each morning weaker, dragging your body through the same chores, staring at fields locked in snow, knowing the granary holds nothing but dust. Even laughter at the tavern grows thin because there's nothing left to drink and no strength left to joke. So no, winter wasn't an endless banquet. It was a slow hunger, a test of endurance, a gamble on whether your stores or your body would give out first. That steaming pottage in the pot, it wasn't hearty stew, it was watery survival. But believe it or not, the myth of luxurious medieval beds is about to crack neckstand. It's colder than you think. You imagine sliding into a medieval noble's bed, a mountain of feather mattresses, silken sheets, and thick fur blankets, keeping you snug while the wind howls outside. The myth says noble bedrooms were warm sanctuaries, almost spa-like compared to peasant huts. But in reality, even kings and queens shivered themselves to sleep. Yes, nobles had massive beds, some so wide that whole families or entourages could share them. They hung thick curtains around the frame to trap warmth, creating what we'd call a bedroom inside a bedroom. But no matter how many furs you piled on top, the stone walls around you still breathed cold. Drafts slipped in through arrow slits, under doors, and straight across the floor. Imagine tucking yourself in only to feel an icy breeze tickle your toes. From the eyes of a castle maid, you tiptoe into the chamber to stoke the fire, only to find frost clinging to the bed curtains and the Lord himself asleep with his nose red as a berry. You bow and leave quickly because the chill inside is worse than the corridor. And the fires. Forget steady warmth. Fireplaces were small, smoke clogged the air, and the heat never reached the bed anyway. You lay there under layers of wool, linen, and fur, but your face stayed numb. It was like trying to sleep in a freezer with a candle in the corner. Historians argue whether the heavy bed curtains actually worked as insulation or just trapped stale, smoky air. Some say they helped a little. Others note that even with curtains, people still woke with frost inside their chamber pots. That's right, the water froze overnight, just steps from the bed. Here's a quirky tidbit. Nobles sometimes shared their beds with guests as a sign of honor, but instead of a luxurious treat, it often meant to people lying back to back, both shivering, both silently wishing for another blanket. Imagine being invited to royal hospitality only to leave half frozen. And of course, vermin loved beds. Fleas thrived in the warmth of mattresses stuffed with straw or feathers. You might finally doze off, only to wake scratching furiously. There's even a medieval proverb, better to share a bed with the cold than with fleas. Harsh choice, isn't it? One light joke here people said noble beds were so big you could get lost in them. The sad truth. They were so cold, you wanted to get lost under all those layers, just hoping to find one patch of warmth. Even with every luxury piled on, a medieval bed was less a sanctuary and more a survival bunker. By dawn, you weren't refreshed. You were stiff, smoky, bitten, and still cold. So next time you imagine sinking into a noble's feather mattress, remember, luxury didn't protect you from drafts. Even royalty went to bed shivering. But if you think sleepless nights were bad, wait until you hear how noisy those silent villages really were. When you picture a medieval village at night, you might imagine peace, a hush falling over the huts, smoke drifting gently from chimneys, and families drifting into deep, dreamless sleep. But silence, that was the biggest myth of all. Nights in the Middle Ages were anything but quiet. Start with the homes themselves. Families didn't sleep in separate rooms. Parents, children, and sometimes even grandparents all crammed into the same small space. Add to that the cow tied in the corner, chickens roosting on the rafters, maybe a goat or pig against the wall, and you've got a barnyard chorus humming beside your bed. Instead of silence, you fell asleep to the squeals, snorts, and restless scratching of animals. From a peasant child's view, you wake in the dark, your little brother kicking you in his sleep, the cow shifting its weight loudly, and your mother muttering a prayer because the baby won't stop crying. The hut is alive with sound, and sleep feels like a rare luxury. And then there were neighbors. Medieval villages had thin walls, wattle and daub, or rough planks. If your neighbor argued with his wife, sang after too much ale, or coughed all night, you heard every bit of it. Privacy didn't exist, and quiet was just as rare. Historians point out that even the night watch added noise. Someone had to guard against thieves, wolves, or fire. So bells rang out at intervals, dogs barked, and watchmen shouted warnings. The idea of stillness, that was modern fantasy. Here's a quirky tidbit. Travelers often complained they couldn't sleep in villages because of the clamor of fowls. Roosters didn't just crow at dawn, they crowed whenever they pleased, even in the middle of the night. One monk sarcastically wrote that roosters were God's alarm clock, set too early. And nobles weren't spared either. In castles, guards patrolled, gates creaked, dogs barked at shadows, and servants clattered down stone halls at all hours. You might fall asleep under heavy blankets, but you'd be jolted awake by the sound of armor echoing down the corridor. One joke often told in taverns, the only silent night is the one after too much ale. Meaning, you'd only sleep through the noise if you were drunk enough to pass out. And as if human and animal sounds weren't enough, people genuinely feared supernatural ones. The creak of wood in the night, the whistle of wind through cracks, it wasn't just noise. It was a reminder of spirits, demons, and things that lurked in the dark. For many, sleep wasn't peaceful, it was anxious. So the idea of silent, restful medieval nights, pure fiction. You would have spent them tossing, turning, and waking at every sound, from a goat shifting in the straw to a neighbor's cough echoing through thin walls. And if you think noise was the worst, wait until you discover how even kings and queens wrapped in wealth couldn't escape the same bitter cold as peasants. It's tempting to think that cold was only a problem for peasants. After all, kings and queens lived in stone castles, wore layers of velvet, and dined by firelight. Surely they escaped the misery. The myth says yes. The truth, winter leveled everyone. Even the most powerful rulers shivered in their royal chambers. Start with the stone castles themselves. Those towering fortresses looked majestic from the outside, but on the inside they were giant iceboxes. Stone absorbed the chill of winter and radiated it inward. The higher the hall, the harder it was to heat. Imagine sitting on a throne while your breath fogs in the air and icicles hang from the rafters. Majesty doesn't keep your fingers from going numb. From the perspective of a royal scribe, you sit hunched over a parchment, the ink freezing in its pot, your quill squeaking across stiff vellum as your hands tremble. The king himself sits nearby, wrapped in furs, coughing into a handkerchief, no warmer than you are. Power doesn't make the air any less frigid. Historians note that even royal inventories show endless lists of furs, blankets, and braziers, yet records still mention kings complaining of the cold. One French queen was known to hold audiences from bed because it was the only way to keep half warm under layers of covers. Nobility did not mean comforted, just meant you suffered in style. And here's a quirky tidbit in the courts of Burgundy. Nobles wore so many layers indoors that visitors joked they looked like bundled onions. Status symbols or not, those clothes weren't about fashion, they were survival gear. Even the food was no shield. While peasants chewed watery pottage, nobles feasted on richer fare, but the cold spoiled it quickly. Mold spread across cheeses, meat turned sour, and fish stank despite barrels of salt. More than one feast ended with stomach aches from half-rotten food. One small joke here. Medieval people used to say the crown keeps the head high but not warm. It was true. A golden circlet looked impressive but offered less warmth than a peasant's wool hat. And in sieges, the divide between noble and commoner collapsed completely. When supplies ran out, kings and peasants alike ate rats, boiled horse hides, and chewed on whatever they could find. Hunger, smoke, and cold sat at every table, no matter the rank. Scholars still debate whether nobles truly suffered as much as peasants. Some argue that wealth gave them slightly better insulation. Others insist the shared cold was one of the few universal medieval experiences. But no historian denies that royalty coughed through the same winters as the poorest farmer. So, next time you imagine a queen sipping wine by the hearth, picture her instead pulling the blanket tighter, her nose red, her breath misting in the air, just another victim of the cold. Because in the Middle Ages, frost didn't care about crowns. Everyone shivered. But the next myth is darker still, because that same fire meant to warm you often turned into a silent killer. When you picture a medieval hearth, you probably imagine glowing embers, crackling logs, and families huddled close for warmth. The myth says that as long as there was fire, people stayed cozy. But here's the ugly truth. Smoke didn't just sting the eyes, it filled lungs, blackened walls, and slowly killed the people it was meant to protect. Start with the huts of peasants. Most didn't even have chimneys. Fires were lit in open pits on the floor, and the smoke just drifted upward, seeping out through the thatch roof. In the meantime, it curled around everyone, inside eyes watering, lungs burning, and babies coughing before they could even walk. Families lived in a haze so thick you could barely see across the room. From the perspective of a young mother, you sit with your infant pressed to your chest, rocking them while their tiny body rattles with coughs. The fire smolders weakly, filling the room with choking smoke. And though you know it's harming them, there's no choice without the fire. The cold would kill. Historians argue whether smoke actually provided some benefit by preserving timber roofs against rot and pests. Some claim that soot deterred insects and hardened the wood. But they also agree the health costs were severe. Chronic bronchitis, eye infections, and shortened lifespans were common in smoky households. Even in castles, fireplaces were no miracle. Chimneys were new and inefficient, and smoke often billowed back into the room. Guests might arrive for a feast, only to leave red-eyed and coughing, their fine clothes reeking of soot. It wasn't the cozy glow you imagine. It was like dining inside a campfire. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some regions, peasants deliberately left holes in the roof for smoke to escape. These smoke holes worked, but they also let in rain, snow, and freezing drafts. So you had a cruel choice: choke on smoke or sleep under a dripping roof. One small joke from taverns went, "Our ale is cloudy, but not as cloudy as our homes." Everyone knew the haze of a smoky hut was as normal as the haze of watered beer. And smoke wasn't just a nuisance, it carried real danger. Chimney fires spread easily, and in tightly packed villages, one spark could reduce an entire row of cottages to ash. Families feared both the cold and the fire that could wipe them out in minutes. Scholars debate just how much smoke shortened lives, but skeletal remains show signs of lung disease, even in children. That cough that never went away, it was the soundtrack of medieval life. So while you imagine a hearth as the heart of the home, remember, it was also a slow suffocation chamber. Warmth came at the price of smoke-filled lungs, watery eyes, and restless nights. And if you think smoke was bad, wait until you hear the next myth, a belief that winter meant fresh meat supplies, because the truth is far more rotten than you'd expect. There's a common image of medieval winters, where families survive easily by eating meat stored in barrels, smoked hams hanging from rafters, and salted fish stacked in cellars. The myth says cold weather preserved everything. The reality: winter meat supplies were a race against rot, salt shortages, and hungry rats. After slaughter season in late autumn, villages did their best to prepare. Animals were killed before fodder ran out, and the meat was salted, smoked, or dried. But medieval preservation wasn't perfect. Salt was expensive and often in short supply. Too little salt meant the meat spoiled anyway. Too much, and it became nearly inedible. Imagine chewing leather, only to discover it still tasted faintly rotten. From the eyes of a castle cook, you lift the lid of a barrel, hoping to find pork still edible, but the brine is cloudy, and the stench hits instantly. You gag, glance at the scullions, and know you'll have to trim away the green parts and hope no one notices at the Lord's table. Historians confirm that meat spoilage was a chronic winter problem. Rats and mice invaded stores, gnawed through barrels, and spread disease. Mold crept across cheeses, and worms infested smoked fish. One scholar even noted that by February, much of the winter store was already wasted. Families weren't living on fresh meat, they were surviving on scraps. Here's a quirky tidbit: some households disguised spoiled food with heavy spices. Medieval recipes often called for cinnamon, cloves, and pepper, not just for taste, but to mask the smell of decay. In fact, the expensive spice trade thrived partly because it made bad meat barely edible, and peasants Most didn't have barrels of meat to begin with. They relied on whatever tiny scraps they could beg, or on bones boiled into watery broth. Winter feasts were often little more than a thin soup flavored with marrow. If you're picturing ham legs dangling from the rafters, think again. For most people, rafters were empty. One tavern joke said, "The rats ate better than we did," and sadly, it wasn't far from the truth. Grain and meat stores attracted rodents in droves. More than one chronicle mentions families going hungry while watching rats scurry fat and bold across their floors. Scholars still debate just how common famine was, but everyone agrees winters tested survival. Even nobility ate food that today would be thrown straight into the trash. So, next time you imagine winter storerooms overflowing with meat, remember the reality: rancid barrels, gnawed loaves, moldy cheese, and rats that seemed impossible to kill. And if you think spoiled meat was bad, wait until you learn that huts weren't empty at night. Families shared their sleeping space with animals, and not for company. When you imagine a medieval peasant's hut at night, you probably picture emptiness, a quiet family curled under blankets, the fire fading, silence falling. The myth says huts were empty, bare, and lonely. The truth: huts were crowded, noisy, and packed with animals because livestock were the only space heaters peasants had. Peasant homes weren't large. Many were one-room structures with dirt floors, wattle walls, and a smoky fire pit. Families squeezed together on straw bedding in one corner. But right across from them, cows, goats, pigs, or sheep huddled too. Their body heat helped keep the space survivable. Imagine drifting to sleep with your children pressed against you, and a cow's warm flank just an arm's reach away. From a father's point of view, you lie awake, listening to your baby fuss, the goat bleating softly, and the pig shifting noisily in the straw. You're grateful for the warmth, but the stench of manure and the fleas hopping in the bedding make rest nearly impossible. Historians agree that bringing animals inside was essential in harsh winters. Without them, huts were simply too cold. Scholars still argue about the exact layout, whether livestock were penned off or roamed freely, but no one denies the smell. Archaeological digs reveal layers of compacted animal dung inside living spaces, proof that medieval nights were anything but pristine. Here's a quirky tidbit: in some northern villages, people actually built longhouses where humans lived at one end and animals at the other, sharing the same roof. The arrangement worked for heat, but guaranteed that mornings began with mucking manure. And if you think nobles avoided this, think again. Even in castles, horses and hunting dogs often slept indoors. Servants stabled animals in lower halls or nearby chambers, meaning the smell and sound of livestock was familiar even to the upper classes. One light joke peasants sometimes made: "The cow snores louder than my husband." They weren't exaggerating. Cattle shifted and grunted all night long, and chickens flapped from the rafters, showering straw and feathers below. Scholars debate whether this closeness improved survival or worsened disease. Some argue that body heat truly kept families alive. Others note that zoonotic illnesses, diseases passing from animals to humans, likely spread in these crowded huts. Whatever the case, it was a grim trade-off: warmth bought at the price of stench and sickness. So, no, medieval huts weren't empty shelters. They were crowded, smoky, and alive with every sound and smell of the barn. Sleep came in short, restless snatches, never in silence. And if you think animals in your bed were bad, wait until you see what medieval doctors thought they could do for winter illnesses. The myth says medieval medicine had an answer for everything. Catch a cough, call the doctor. Fall ill in winter, a potion or poultice will set you right. But the reality was grim. Medieval doctors had little power against winter illnesses, and what started as a small cough could easily spiral into death. Cold air weakened bodies, and smoke-filled huts irritated lungs. Children wheezed before they could walk, and elders coughed until they couldn't rise. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and bronchitis ran rampant through villages every winter. But instead of antibiotics, you got leeches, bleeding, and prayers. Imagine lying in bed, fever burning, while your family watches helplessly as the village healer mutters about humors and balance. From the perspective of a peasant woman, you clutch your husband's hand as he coughs into a rag spotted red. The doctor arrives with a pouch of herbs, waves incense over him, and prescribes wine mixed with powdered toad. You nod silently, though you know in your heart it won't save him. Historians point out that medieval medical theory revolved around the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Winter illnesses were blamed on excess phlegm, so treatments aimed to purge or balance it. But bleeding and purging only weakened patients further. Scholars still debate whether herbal remedies had any effect at all, or whether survival depended purely on luck. Here's a quirky tidbit. Garlic was considered a cure-all, from coughs to demons. Families hung braids of garlic by bedsides, hoping to ward off both sickness and spirits. At least garlic offered one benefit: it kept people at a distance, which probably slowed infection by accident. And nobles fared no better. Rich lords called in university-trained physicians, but these men often prescribed exotic treatments: ground pearls, powdered emeralds, or concoctions spiced with saffron that cost fortunes, yet did nothing. A royal crown couldn't protect lungs any more than a peasant's wool cap. One light joke of the time said, "The doctor comes and the patient dies richer." It was bitter humor born of experience, because often the cure drained families' pockets while the sickness drained their lives. Worse, winter coughs sometimes snowballed into epidemics. In crowded villages, one illness swept through entire families. When plague seasons overlapped with harsh winters, mortality soared. Villagers buried loved ones in frozen ground, their own breath misting as they lowered the bodies. Scholars argue whether medieval people accepted this as fate or fought against it with faith and ritual. Some accounts show people turning to saints for intercession. Others show communities banding together in desperate care. What's certain is that illness was not a matter of if, but when. So, while the myth paints doctors as protectors, the truth is they were often powerless. Winter was a season of coughs that lingered, lungs that failed, and graves that filled. And if sickness wasn't terrifying enough, imagine the fear that stalked the nights, because people believed winter darkness belonged not just to wolves, but to demons and ghosts. We like to think faith gave medieval people comfort in the long, dark winters. The myth says prayer and holy symbols kept them safe. But when the sun set and the cold settled in, fear often grew sharper. Too many winter nights belonged to more than wolves. They belonged to spirits, demons, and the restless dead. Imagine lying on a straw bed, the fire dying down, shadows creeping across the rafters. The wind whistles through cracks in the hut, sounding like voices. To you, every creak in the wood is a ghost, every draft a demon's breath. Faith doesn't banish the fear, it only names it. From the perspective of a shepherd, you walk back from the fields at dusk, clutching your rosary. The snow crunches underfoot, but every flicker in the tree line makes your heart race. You whisper prayers, not because you're pious, but because you're afraid of what waits beyond the dark. Historians point out that medieval Europe was steeped in superstition. Winter nights were long, and the boundary between the natural and the supernatural felt thin. People believed demons prowled in storms, witches cursed households, and restless souls wandered the roads. Faith offered protection, but it also fueled the imagination. One quirky tidbit: villagers hung iron scissors above cradles to ward off evil spirits, or placed bread and salt at doorways to keep demons from entering. These charms had nothing to do with theology. They were practical magic wrapped in Christian belief. Even castles weren't safe from dread. Guards whispered of phantom figures seen on battlements. Servants claimed to hear voices in empty halls, and noble families clutched relics in the night for safety. The higher the walls, the deeper the shadows. And the church itself reinforced fear. Priests preached that sin opened doors to devils. A winter cough wasn't just sickness, it could be punishment. Thunderstorms in the night, proof that demons roared outside. Faith was comfort, yes, but it was also a reminder of constant danger. One small joke people sometimes made: the rooster crows for the sun, but also to chase away ghosts. Humor was their way of laughing through fear, though most still believed the night belonged to spirits. Scholars debate whether fear of demons was genuine or a way to explain natural dangers. Was it truly ghosts people feared, or just wolves, thieves, and the cold itself? What's certain is that faith and fear blended into one long, restless vigil each night. So, no, faith didn't mean peaceful sleep. It meant clinging to charms, whispering prayers, and staring into the dark, hoping the shadow at the door was only the wind. And if fear of spirits wasn't enough, the next myth reveals something colder still: the belief that winter meant peace inside castle walls, when, in reality, sieges turned those walls into traps of starvation. You might imagine castle walls as shields against every danger of winter. Behind high gates and towers, surely nobles enjoyed peace, protected from hunger and war. The myth says thick walls guaranteed safety, but the truth: castles often became prisons. In winter, those same walls trapped people inside as supplies dwindled and starvation closed in. Sieges were common, and winter was the perfect time for an enemy to surround a stronghold. Crops were gone, fields were bare, and no fresh food could be gathered. Defenders had to survive on what they'd stored in autumn, and it rarely lasted. Imagine being locked behind walls, hearing the enemy's campfires outside, knowing there was no way to resupply until spring. From the perspective of a servant in a besieged castle, you shuffle to the storeroom only to find bare shelves. The grain sacks are gone, the salted meat barrels empty. The Lord orders rations, but you already feel your ribs pressing against your skin. At night, the enemy shouts insults over the walls, while your stomach growls, louder than their taunts. Historians point out that sieges killed more by hunger than by battle. Arrows and catapults were terrifying, but starvation was relentless. Even mighty fortresses fell because their defenders simply couldn't eat. Records describe nobles boiling leather, gnawing horse bones, and, in some desperate cases, turning to cannibalism. Here's a quirky tidbit. During one siege in France, defenders tossed freshly baked bread over the walls to fool the enemy into thinking they had plenty. In reality, it was their last loaf. The ruse didn't last, and hunger soon forced surrender. And castles weren't alone in this misery. Whole towns, walled for protection, became traps during winter blockades. People starved behind gates meant to save them, the walls turning into stone cages. One bitter joke from medieval chronicles went, "The enemy does not kill us with swords, but with spoons." It was dark humor, born from eating smaller and smaller rations until nothing was left to scoop. Scholars debate whether lords truly prepared enough for sieges, or if poor planning doomed them. Some argue supply management could stretch months. Others insist desperation struck within weeks. Either way, life behind walls was far from peaceful. It was claustrophobic, smoky, and starving. So while the myth paints castles as safe winter havens, the reality was harsh. Walls kept enemies out, but also kept hunger in. And when spring didn't come soon enough, even kings in their fortresses learned that walls were no protection from an empty stomach. But if castles weren't safe, what about peasants in the open fields? You'll be surprised to hear how resourceful they became when survival itself was on the line. It's easy to think peasants were completely helpless in the face of medieval winter's passive victims of cold and hunger. The myth says they simply suffered until spring, powerless against nature. But the truth? Survival demanded creativity, and peasants used every trick imaginable to keep themselves and their families alive. When grain stores ran empty, people turned to desperate substitutes. Bark bread was one of the most infamous. Tree bark ground into powder, mixed with whatever flour remained, and baked into bitter, chewy loaves. It barely nourished, but it filled the stomach. Chroniclers describe it as a meal of despair, but to starving families, it was still better than nothing. From the perspective of a mother, you kneel by the hearth, scraping birch bark into the flour sack. Your children watch silently, wide-eyed, knowing the bread you bake tonight will taste of wood and ash. You smile anyway, because their bellies will be less empty. Roots and wild plants became lifelines too. Families dug up turnips, carrots, and parsnips left buried under snow. They foraged dried nettles or boiled acorns into soups. Survival wasn't about comfort, it was about finding calories in the frozen earth. Historians point out that peasants had vast practical knowledge of their environment. They knew which herbs could be eaten, which trees yielded edible bark, and how to stretch even the thinnest supplies. Scholars still debate whether bark bread was widespread or only a last resort, but all agree ingenuity made the difference between life and death. Here's a quirky tidbit. Peasants sometimes faked abundance to lift spirits. A feast might mean little more than arranging scraps on a table with ceremony. Children were told stories of plenty while eating broth so thin you could see the bottom of the bowl. Even animals became resources in creative ways. When cows stopped giving milk, people thinned what little they had with water, making it last longer. Chickens were treasured for eggs, though in the coldest months they often stopped laying. Rats were hunted, not just as pests. One tavern joke said, "The Lord feasts on the cow. The peasant feasts on the cow's shadow." It was bitter humor, but it revealed the truth. Peasants learned to make do with what nobles ignored. And this resilience wasn't just physical, it was mental. Villages pooled resources, neighbors shared when they could, and traditions like communal feasts helped people feel less alone. Even if the food was poor, the sense of unity gave strength. So no, peasants weren't helpless victims. They were resourceful survivors, turning bark, roots, and scraps into life. They fought winter with stubborn ingenuity, proving that even in the harshest cold, humans will always find a way to endure. But endurance had its limits, and the final myth that spring was always close turned out to be the cruelest illusion of all. We like to think of spring as inevitable. The myth says medieval people only had to hang on for a short while before the snow melted, fields bloomed, and food returned. But the cruel truth: winters stretched on endlessly, dragging through months of hunger, sickness, and despair. Spring was not close, it was a distant hope. In northern Europe, winter could grip the land from November to April. That meant nearly half the year was spent in cold and scarcity. Imagine waking in February, weak from thin rations, and realizing the fields are still locked in frost. March brings no relief, storms continue, supplies are gone, and hunger deepens. Spring doesn't feel like salvation. It feels like a mirage. From the point of view of a weary peasant, you kneel in the barn, breaking apart the last frozen turnip with trembling hands. Your children watch silently, their cheeks hollow, while outside, snow still blankets the earth. You whisper, "Soon, soon," though you no longer believe it yourself. Historians emphasize how the hungry gap defined medieval survival. This was the period in late winter when old stores were exhausted but new crops hadn't yet grown. Even in good years, it was a season of gnawing emptiness. In bad years, famine swept through entire regions. Scholars still debate whether climate fluctuations, like the Little Ice Age, made winters harsher, but the records are clear. Whole villages perished waiting for spring. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some communities tried to cheat the season by sprouting peas and beans indoors, using damp cloths and ashes. The result? Small, bitter shoots that offered more hope than calories. But in the depths of winter, even that green was a miracle. And despair wasn't just about food. It was about time itself. People counted days by the dwindling candles and listened to the howling wind. Church bells marked weeks, but instead of celebration, they sounded like reminders that winter refused to end. One grim tavern joke said, "We will drink in May if May ever comes." It wasn't just humor. It was a coping mechanism, a way to laugh in the face of endless cold. Nobles endured the same waiting. Their larders emptied, their beds stayed cold, and their households fell sick. A crown or castle offered no shortcut through the calendar. Spring could not be bought, it had to be endured. So no, spring was not always close. Winters dragged for months, grinding people down until survival felt like a question of will as much as body. Hunger, cold, and darkness were companions that overstayed their welcome year after year. And perhaps the harshest truth of all, survival was never simple. Even one night in a medieval winter could break you, body and spirit alike. You've walked through every myth of the medieval winter, and maybe a part of you still clings to the idea that people were tougher back then, that survival was somehow easier, simpler, more natural. The myth says medieval life was hard but manageable, that humans were built to endure it without complaint. The truth is harsher. Even one night in those winters could break you, body and spirit alike. Think of the layers of suffering stacked together: drafty walls, smoky fires, endless coughing, restless animals, bitter food, and nights echoing with fear. Surviving wasn't a matter of being strong. It was a matter of being stubborn. People clung to life with calloused hands and weary hearts because there was no other choice. From the perspective of a weary villager, you lie awake, listening to the wind clawing at the roof, your stomach gnawing with hunger, your children shifting beside you. You whisper promises that spring will come, even though you're not sure you'll live to see it. That single night stretches on forever, heavier than the snow outside. Historians debate whether we romanticize medieval resilience too much. Some argue they were hardened by constant exposure. But skeletal remains tell a bleaker story. Disease, malnutrition, and stunted growth reveal lives cut short by relentless hardship. There was nothing simple about survival. It was costly, painful, and uncertain. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval proverbs often compared winter to an enemy. Winter wages no war, yet kills more than swords. One saying went. People knew the cold was deadlier than any night. So, no, life back then wasn't easier. Survival wasn't guaranteed. And the myth that humans once endured winters without breaking, that's just nostalgia speaking. In truth, one medieval winter would test you more than a lifetime of modern ones. And now, as we close our journey, let that thought fade. The stone walls crumble away, the smoke clears, the hunger softens. You're safe in the present, far from those endless nights. Subscribe before you drift off, so you wake to new history every night. End of script. Sweet dreams.